Hi, let's talk a little bit about the science of adverse childhood experiences and toxic stress. Adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, are potentially traumatic events experienced before the age of 18. The term ACEs comes from the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, conducted in 1998. The study was a partnership between Kaiser Permanente and the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It was one of the largest investigations ever conducted to assess connections between early adversity and adult health. The study is the basis for the 10 core ACEs listed here. These ACEs are usually characterized in three categories of abuse, neglect, and household instability. The specific items include physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, and living in a household where a member has a severe mental illness or substance dependence, where the child has witnessed violence against their mother, there has been separation from a caregiver due to divorce, or a household member has been incarcerated. Researchers continue to build understanding around these core ACEs and other potentially traumatic experiences in childhood that are associated with negative health outcomes. What the ACEs study told us is that ACEs are incredibly common across the population, with over 2/3 of the adult population having experienced at least one ACE. We've also have data that shows that nearly half of all children today have experienced at least one ACE. I encourage you to learn more about how the ACEs data looks in your community. The study also pointed to a dose-response relationship, meaning that the more ACEs that someone had, the greater their likelihood of negative health outcomes. In this slide, we show the leading causes of death in the US. And you can see the drastic increases in likelihood that someone may experience with 4 or more ACEs in comparison to 0. Similarly, we find that health and developmental concerns associated with ACEs also appear during childhood. Among infants, studies have found that associations between ACEs and growth delay, cognitive delay, and sleep disruption. In middle childhood, we find associations between ACEs and asthma, reoccurring infection, learning difficulties, and behavioral problems. And in adolescence, we find associations between ACEs and violence, bullying, smoking, teen pregnancy, and weight management. So the question is, how do these early social experiences turn into health-damaging ones? What we now understand is that these early experiences act as a stressor on the body, and in doing so, activate our stress response. While this stress response is highly adaptive and generally functions well, when it is activated over and over and over again, it can become health-damaging. This arrow shows us the spectrum of the stress response, including positive, tolerable, and toxic stress. The physiologic response to stress depends on the nature of the stressors and the availability of buffering and coping strategies in the individual. A positive or tolerable stress response is characterized by a return to homeostasis, whereas a toxic stress response may induce lasting changes. More specifically, toxic stress is characterized by prolonged or frequent activation of the stress response that leads to a dysregulation of the neuroendocrine immune circuitry, which produces altered levels of important hormones and neurotransmitters, and ultimately changes in brain architecture and multiple organ systems. ACEs aren't the full story, though, when it comes to determining a child's risk for developing toxic stress. This scale, borrowed from the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative, provides a good way of explaining why this is. Think of this scale as weighing the things, both good and bad, that may affect a person's health. The positive things are called protective factors, namely an attentive caregiver, and other things that may help create a safe and stable foundation to promote health in the individual. The other end of the scale holds the bad things, or risk factors. ACEs are risk factors. And then there's the fulcrum. The fulcrum represents the biological makeup of a person. Our biological makeup includes our genes, which may make us more or less susceptible to stressful experiences. Also, although our genes don't change, other factors may influence how our body reacts to stress. One reason we focus on children when we talk about ACEs and toxic stress is that children's brains are particularly malleable and therefore impacted by both positive and negative experiences more substantially. On the scale, we see that the position of the fulcrum affects how much leverage protective and risk factors have in shaping our life outcomes. A person with a scale weighed down by risk factors will have increased risk for stress-related diseases. It is also important to note that there are many potential pathways through which a person's health may be influenced by their social experiences. In this training, we're focused on ACEs as a risk factor for toxic stress. The broader term social determinants of health often refers to structural factors that influence health. For example, access to healthcare services, transportation, income, education. These factors may also impact your patient's health outcomes, but they may do so through other pathways, like making it difficult for patients to get medications or travel to the clinic or have the right information. The distinction may matter when we think about why we are screening for ACEs, what it means in terms of prevention and follow-up, and what other services may matter for your patient population. So now let's take a little closer look at how toxic stress may impact the body. This image outlines the multisystemic effects of toxic stress. The neurologic effects can include overactivity and difficulty turning off the stress response, increased fear response, impaired executive function, difficulty with learning and memory, and increased risky behaviors. The immunological effects can include changes to the inflammatory mediators and markers of inflammation, and inhibition of anti-inflammatory pathways, which can lead to increases in infections and chronic inflammation. The endocrine effects result in long-term changes to hormones involved in stress activation. The changes in hormones are related to growth, puberty, and metabolism. And research has also found epigenetic effects, which include changes in the way DNA is read and expressed, which can lead to changes in the way that the brain and organ systems respond to stress, premature cell death, and altered cell replication, which in turn increases risk for diseases such as diabetes and cancer. As we've seen, there can be substantial individual variability in how early adversity and toxic stress manifests over the life course. In this image, we see a few different possible trajectories as examples. First, starting at the top, it's possible that an individual or a child who experiences ACEs doesn't present any symptoms over his lifetime and ends up having a healthy life as an adult. Moving to the very bottom, we see a child who experiences toxic stress, shown as the disruption to the neuroendocrine and immune functions, which manifests as social, emotional, or cognitive impairment, and can lead to the adoption of health risk behaviors, and later to disease and disability. These are likely the individuals that you've already identified through your practices as needing extra support or intervention. But in the middle, we see a child who's experienced toxic stress but perhaps doesn't present the more obvious behavioral symptoms. Perhaps their symptoms are in the form of failure to thrive, reoccurring infections, or uncontrolled asthma. Perhaps this child has no recognizable symptoms, but as an adult, still experiences premature disability or disease. It's because of these very presentations of toxic stress physiology that we find screening for risk of toxic stress to be essential. So where does this all leave us? What can we do about this? The good news is that we can do something. We can do this by reducing exposure to risk factors for toxic stress and promptly intervening. We reduce exposure by systematically screening all kids for ACEs. We couple this with prompt intervention, starting with appropriate medical care that considers ACEs science. We then seek to enhance protective factors, including supporting parents in developing their skills or enhancing their skills, helping them reduce their stress, and focusing on good sleep hygiene, nutrition, exercise, and mindfulness or meditative practices with the children. We address other modifiable risk factors, such as transportation or housing barriers, or other factors that may increase insecurity and stress for families or create barriers for accessing healthcare. And then we seek to link children and families to therapeutic interventions, in particular those who have been exposed to high doses of adversity, And when we talk about young children, this often means that we seek out dyadic therapy for caregivers and children together. Thank you for listening. Hope this brief overview has given you some additional information. We look forward to engaging with you through the National Pediatric Practice Community on ACEs.